Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Well, there we go. We're recording. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Hi, Jeremy. Hello, listeners.
How's your last week in some bin?
It's been a week. We recorded last Thursday. Yeah, it's been all right.
Did you get any gaming of any sort in?
I think we must have done because Brian ran 2 sessions over the last 2 weeks, so yeah, must not have talked about it last week. So we managed another D&D session a week ago.
How's that going anyway? I mean, I know we had talked earlier in the year about that your kind of 3-part world building exercise with switching GMs and all that stuff. How's that going so far?
I think we kind of I feel like we lost a bit of momentum, like because I was away for 2 weeks and then Scott couldn't do a few weeks. So I think in the last sort of 2 months we've managed, I don't know, like 2 sessions or 3 sessions or something. So that kind of took the impetus off it for me. I mean, how many sessions? I've run, I don't know, I've run like 4 or 5 sessions, and Brian's run like 5 or 6 sessions. Scott's run 2. So we've played more sessions. We've played more sessions now of this D&D 3 campaigns than we did of Strahd, and that was like our previous longest running thing. So, we've had a really good go at it. But yeah, I mean, the other 2 for the moment are kind of like, well, let's carry on. I think I might kind of say, well, I don't mind carrying on for a bit, but I don't really want to be carrying this on like all the way.
Partly I'm thinking like make it work in the story. When you're running it next time, you just drop in a portal. A portal to somewhere a la Tomb of Horrors, where you just the portal just screws you over, or turns you into something you don't want to be or whatever. You could just step through the portal and you're on a Corellian cruiser or something like that, and then problem solved. But let's talk about Bond, James Bond. Always says that. My name is Bond, James Bond.
So we did a session on kind of what's the important things in Bond.
The essential elements of James Bond.
Yeah. Which that has been released.
Yep. Yesterday.
There you go.
And now we're going to talk about our ideas, initial ideas that we're going to then go at some pace, in some way, work on. I think that's what we ought to do. We ought to come up with some ideas now. We have ideas, but talk about them, nail down a few directions and ways, and then individually we can work on them over time. I know that in the next month or so, I have like no time to work on them because I have other gaming things that have deadlines.
I just have no time because I'm now marking again.
Right. So okay, on to Bond.
It was funny because we did our classic after the last episode. We stopped recording and then had a bunch of really good ideas, and then realized we weren't recording anymore. So I had to frantically write down a bunch of the stuff. As usual, I said we kind of were thinking about character creation, not so much character creation in terms of how to make a character, more in terms of what would Bond's character sheet look like, or what would the bad guys like stats be, so we know what we're going to roll against. Yeah, because like one of the ideas you had is that the whole point of this is not just like average spy thing. It's you're playing James Bond or a version of James Bond.
You're playing an individual operator.
Yeah,
doesn't work as part of teams. Is the motive force in, aside from the villain's plot. There aren't other inputs. Again, it's not like Mission Impossible. It's not like Leverage. So I think you're right that we have to focus on like, what does that Bond character sheet look like? And we'll just use Bond as the term for the super spy.
I think
what does that character sheet look like?
We've kind of said the character is going to be super capable, and this straight away throws things like, well, your standard stat and skill array might not be appropriate here because James Bond or insert other spy person is good at everything.
Or is good at finding ways to make things advantageous for himself. So if, for example, there isn't, it's odd. It's like he always seems to shape the moment to fit him rather than he shows up and fits the moment. Like, yeah, sometimes he'll have gadgets or things like that that'll be just right for the moment. Um, but when it comes to his abilities, you're right. He tends to be able to adapt to just about anything and work through it. So
Yeah,
how
and I
do
think
we
that was kind of a
represent that?
thing that the characters either like they're either very highly skilled, and the things where they're not skilled in that area, they will either have a sidekick or a gadget.
Yeah.
So essentially, just doing sort of stats and skills isn't going to work. So one of the things I suggested, and I'm going to suggest it again so that you can throw it out, so we can have the same argument we did last week. Well, it wasn't an argument because it was like, yeah, you're right. Was I said maybe we should use drives here when you can't use your standard stat and skill approach. One of the possibilities is to use something like drives or values. So like we've seen in June, and I've seen in other games. So you can have duty and honor and glory and greed, etc., etc.
Yeah, all those kinds of things.
Yes, because that's something you could use if you're not using standard stat and skill.
Right.
This is where you say your butt.
The trouble with that, and that is all true. The trouble is, like, what's Bond's drive? You could say, God save the king, or for Britannia, or whatever. You could say for women with weird names. That's his drive. But he seems to have a very narrow. We don't ever really question. Bond isn't. The one thing with drives, I think, is that if you want to have your character be multifaceted, ideally at least, if you want to have your character or have characters have different elements to their person, drives can work, because then you pull them in different directions given the situations in which you put them. Bond never. There's never any kind of angsty hand-wringing or questioning. I mean, maybe these Daniel Craig ones, but we're not. We're Connery and we're Roger Moore.
Even with the Daniel Craig ones, it still would come down to the same thing, that it becomes very clear that Bond's main duty, or Bond's main drive, is duty.
Yeah.
It's his duty to, whether it's his country or the MI5 or the King, whatever, it's still that is duty. So his thing would be duty. And the problem is that feeling actually, and it's what we've said previously about drives and values, he would always roll on that in almost every single situation. Bond would write, well, I'm rolling duty because he's either
so there's
doing
no point.
Yeah,
you don't have drives. You have drive.
Okay, occasionally he might be out for revenge, and occasionally he might just really be wanting to get his end away. But like 95% of the time, it would be duty. Bond isn't greedy. He's not bothered about money. So that's not, and he isn't bothered about glory.
No.
So that's
and
that's
you know what
the
trouble is, if you were to, and we're not saying this, but if you were to say, okay, that's how Bond's going to be defined by drives. Well, there really aren't drives. There's drive, and then there are these every once in a while incidental things that you'd virtually never use. Most of the villains, if you were to approach villain characters like your top level villains in the same manner, we don't have to, you'd have basically the same thing. You'd have megalomania.
Yeah, just
megalomania.
They're all about power.
Megalomania. That's it. That's what you would have. And even the henchmen, I mean, what's Jaws' drive? What's Oddjob's drive? Smash things, smash things with his metal rimmed hat. So I don't think drives would work.
No.
What could?
So I think the stats mate skilled. I don't see it working, because I feel like you're going to be good at most things, and I think it was very, very, you're going to be rolling on the same things all the time. And like I said already, when you're going to do something you're not very good at, you'll have a gadget or something that makes up for that. So it feels like, focused could still be a thing. That might still be, maybe focus or rated focus or some kind of focusing with just a small couple of things, because then the things that Bond's really good at, he could be really good at, and he can still roll against that. But I think we said like approaches might be a good idea. So in terms of Dishonored, approaches that in terms of 2D20, we see approaches in Dishonored. Now they don't call it approaches, they call it styles.
Right.
I mean, the reason I call them approaches, the first time I ever saw these was in Fate Accelerated, where they have 6 approaches: careful, clever, flashy, forceful, quick, sneaky. So this is about how you do something, as opposed to how good you are at doing something, or as opposed to, why
Yeah,
you're doing something.
it's how you, and I think approach is a good term for it because or style could be as well. I mean, I guess it means the same thing basically. But yeah,
Well, and the
how you
Dishonored
go
ones
about
are,
doing things.
yeah, the Dishonored ones are super similar. That what we got: boldly, carefully, cleverly, forcefully, quietly, swiftly. So I think they're basically the same thing. I think the one difference is that we have this flashy one for Fate, and Dishonored doesn't have a flashy, but then it also has forcefully and boldly, which I'm not too sure. So actually,
No, I
personally,
don't really see the difference between
yeah,
those.
I like the Fate ones. They are very clear what they are for and what they're different. And the thing I like about approach is you can kind of see it in a game of someone saying, right, well, I want to cleverly sneak into somewhere. And you can like, okay, well, you can do that. But then obviously, because you're not trying to be sneaky, you're going to, it's difficulty 3 instead of difficulty
Well,
1.
here's what I'm looking at, and I'm looking at page 22 in the 2D20 SRD characters chapter. Okay, page 22, where approaches are. Boldly, carefully, cleverly, forcefully, quietly, swiftly. And I agree with you. Boldly and forcefully are like, I'm not getting the difference between those. So forgetting about what the approaches would be, um, I think that if you used approaches, you could, you as GM would have to establish on your end, using traits or truths, whatever term you want to use, what would be like, what's the state of this place? Like, for example, some kind of, bar or a ball, something like that, some, like, formal event, whatever, in Monte Carlo. That sounds very James Bond. um and he's going to try to sneak it. He's going to try to get into this thing that he doesn't have an invitation to, so he can get near the villain and get the villain's girlfriend to want to be with him instead. So he, whatever, Bond stuff. um you would, I think, on the GM side, have to establish, like, okay, what, and this is actually pretty challenging, I think, in the doing. Like, what is the state of this place in terms of traits, so that would then enable you to think through. The player says, well, I'm going to swing through the window and, like, smash in, something ridiculous, or I'm going to try to, like, getting in cleverly could be, I'm disguised, or I use a fake identity. Getting in stealthily means, like, they're sneaking in through a back door when the kitchen help, is coming in and out to throw away garbage or something like that. And so what would be hard is figuring out, how do you as GM describe through traits a location or a setting or an event, so that as the player says, well, I'm going to go about it in this way, you can adjudicate that mechanically, without it always becoming like a one-trick pony. I think that the what you'd want to do is maybe the character super spy is, like, really good at being stealthy, and so then you challenge that player by creating situations where stealth isn't as useful unless they're clever. But for me, I'm already spinning around in my head and thinking, I don't know how I would actually do that in a way that
I
wouldn't
I
railroad the
feel
player.
I feel like you're overthinking it, because I
Oh, I'm
think
sure I
generally,
am.
I think mostly you could come up with a simple thing of like, right, in any given situation, I think the easy thing to do is for the GM to go, here's the optimal approach, here's the least optimal approach, and everything else in the middle. And if the player picks the optimal approach, it's difficulty 1. If they pick the least optimal, it's difficulty 3 or even higher, and everything else is a difficulty 2, and not have to worry about it
That
that much.
works.
That would give you a nice easy default. And in
Yeah, that
terms of
works.
describing a base, I mean, if you give them the options, then it's up to, well, there's a front door, it's got guards in. Well, that's a player can choose to, just forcefully smash through it. Oh, there's a vent here, or there's this, it's the same with any role playing thing. A player's always going to work out different things. The thing here is a player might try and do different things to, give them a better way of using particular styles. But if you design the encounter in such a way that they can't always use their best things, so
Yeah.
yes, they're really sneaky. Well, occasionally you just go, well, there are motion tripwires and cameras everywhere, so it doesn't matter how sneaky you are, you're not
Well,
getting in. So they
actually,
need to
you
be
know what?
clever instead, and so
You
Yeah, I
make a
think
good
I'd
point.
do an ascension.
You make a good point because the GM could then establish to themselves, like, okay, this is here's the easiest way, here are the typical ways, and here by approach.
Yeah,
Maybe you could even come up with a a cheat sheet where you write out the encounter on a cheat sheet and you check off, like you
yeah,
just you rate or rank the approaches from your vision. You don't tell the player this,
no,
but what would be neat
but you
about
can
that,
hint at
and
it.
say what?
You can hint at it. You
You
can
could
make
hint
it.
at, you just
Yeah,
through description and use of
yeah,
traits. But what you could then do is, as GM, you would, in effect, you would be modulating the how difficult an encounter or a test would be based on your knowledge of that character. Like, that
yeah.
this player and this character is like really stealthy and tough, not particularly like suave. Okay, so you could then create encounters that are like, yeah, it'll be easier for you to get in here because I've built this intentionally, that it becomes pretty obvious to you that stealthing through the duct work is easier than presenting yourself as like the fake heir or something like that at the front door. And so you could adjust how hard it is to work through encounters based on that. Because here'd be a really handy thing. GM running a game for one player. One of the problems that I have when I run Star Trek Adventures is keeping track of 4 freaking determination values. There's the term, per player. So you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I got 3 people around the table and I have 12 values that I have to keep thinking of. No. If I only have one player sitting in front of me, that's a lot easier to tailor encounters, good, bad, ugly, hard, easy, based on that. I like that.
So where we still have a problem is that every single 2D20 game, with one exception, always has 2 sets of stats, which you add together
Yes.
to get your target number.
Yes.
The exception is John Carter. But John Carter, when you do a roll, you pick 2 things. Now, I don't think this is going to work because the whole point is you're picking one approach. So we still then have this issue of we have one set of stats. And so then the thing is, do we have a second one, or do we try and make it work with just one?
I think approaches as like your primary stat. That takes the place of the attribute. How high it goes, we can fight over that, but I think that's good. And then the other one is, I actually think, and hear me out on this, and I may stumble all over myself and decide it sounds stupid once it comes out of my mouth, but Star Trek's disciplines and the default skills, which are really just the disciplines, broad range domains of knowledge or ability, it's not really fiddly. It doesn't get really fiddly like Conan or Infinity. It's not sitting in the middle like Octoon Cthulhu. It's over there on the broad domains range. I think you could use those, because if you wanted to have if you want to make your super spy, your James, make it Bond, or make it your own Bond, your 0012 or something like that. You as a player might think, well, I'd like my character to be more of like the technical type. He can do the social stuff, but he's more of a technical sort. So I think that broad disciplines or domains, whatever you want to call them, I think that's workable. There are talents in some of the games that allow you to create a scene specific focus. And I think a balance between those. I think that your character could have call them like permanent focuses. Like you're just like, hey, my character's really good with martial arts. Like that's one of his signature things. But then also you would have, there's got to be some kind of a mechanic for you to invoke focuses that would be scene only, and you have a very limited pool of them, because then that enables you to really shape shape your character's ability to deal with diffusing the nuclear bomb versus winning at baccarat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's funny because do you know which game we basically are just creating here? It's just 100% Dishonored, because Dishonored has the 5 basic skills. The 6 basic skills. It has styles and it has focuses and talents, but it only has a handful of talents, only has a handful of focuses.
Right.
Which is funny because what is the main purpose of Dishonored? Oh, it's to be a spy.
Yeah.
So it does kind of show that actually when they did Dishonored, they kind of nailed it.
Kind of.
Now,
Here's what I'm
obviously,
thinking though. Here's what I'm thinking though with focuses, and this might not work out, but initially, like at character creation, you would have, whether they're called focuses or not, you would have a few that are they're permanent, they're persistent, they're part of your character. They're like the signature type moves that are for your character. And then you would have a pool, and maybe it would come from something like fortune, maybe it would come from like larger momentum spends, but per session you would have, or per scene maybe, you would have the ability to create something else if you need, like you could spend from a pool to say, I can, I'm an expert boat driver
on the list.
because what?
You mentioned this last week. You've obviously just forgot, or you're not reading notes at the moment. You can't tell. Yeah, you had this idea last time of using fortune to buy assets.
Yep.
Now, at the time, we had an idea of 2 assets. At the time, we said assets could be gadgets. We weren't very clear on what gadgets are, but we basically said assets could be gadgets, or they could be people, like a contact or a psychic or something else. So actually, if we go back to the gadgets idea, one of these things a gadget would let you do then is a gadget would be like a temporary thing that you can use. You could use, and in that thing, it would give you a focus.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
or it might even give you a focus and bump the skills. So it, or it would lower, or it would be a trait. And obviously traits can be used to lower difficulty. So again, but I think one thing we said is that you'd have a bit more because most other games you have maybe 2 points of fortune, and you don't tend to get them during the game. I think one of the things we said with this is like you'll have a load more fortune, because the fortune would be, you might use it in a flashback way. That I mean, I think we're kind of moving on to the next bit now, but I think we've got our idea of characters. So that's fine. It's like we're tweaking Dishonored, so this is now moving on to something we're going to bolt on to that, something new and different. Yeah, the idea of like an asset could be you'll get some that you're given at the start. Q Branch will say, well, you need this thing. This is where the GM's already decided there's going to be a car chase. The GM gives you a car asset.
Yes.
You don't have to pay for that. But halfway through the adventure, you realize that what you could really do with is an exploding pen. So you spend a point of fortune to create an asset. And in this case, it doesn't have, it's not going to give, it's going to do very something. It's a pen that's going to be a bomb. It's going to have a thing. But other times it might be, well, I need to hack a door, but I don't have any door hacking. Oh, well, my mobile phone actually has an app on it, which is going to let me do the door, which, the GM can then, you can then do it as a standard, right? Well, this is going to give you a focus in the door hacking.
I mean, what is, thinking about this, you wouldn't even have to call it a focus, because it would do the same thing that a focus does. What does a focus do? It increases your likelihood in most games of a critical success.
Yeah.
So it would play the role of enabling you to do something, or do something better or faster, or otherwise that you wouldn't be able to. It's a trait.
It is. It's a trait, because it's letting you do. I mean, you could have it. Normally, traits do one of the 4 things.
Yeah.
And in the case of a positive trait, normally a positive trait is it lowers the difficulty or lets you do something you couldn't otherwise. In this case, it is potentially kind of one of the other. Arguably, Bond could pick the door without the thing, but it'd be a really high difficulty.
Yeah.
So this is like massively lower than difficulty. But again, you might want a set of rules that you've written ahead of time that says what assets can do. But
yeah, and you just said it, like initially we have foreshadowing for the kinds of action that are going to happen in a Bond movie and the types of things that Bond is going to do based on what Q gives him. And that could either be at the beginning or period. Everyone's like, I keep going back to You Only Live Twice. Q shows up in Japan with the little mini copter in a bunch of suitcases. And they do this like kind of weird stop motion construction sequence where they put the thing together. So you can, as GM, make sure that Bond has the things that he needs in order to succeed. Now, what I'm thinking with those assets, and that's the term I keep coming back to with them, is that they would all be seen. They once you activate them, unless it's something really mundane like your pistol, but that wouldn't be an asset. That would not be an asset that you would be provided, that you would have to activate. And I think that's the term I'm thinking of. Like, you have assets, and once you activate them, they are good for the scene only.
Yeah.
Because like we said last week, there are very few instances where Bond has two car chases in one movie or
Yeah.
uses the same clever device twice. It happens, but it's not common.
Yeah, I mean, like the exploding pen I was referring back to is what in GoldenEye that
Yeah,
pen gets used once because then it blows up. It doesn't get used again. The amount of these gadgets that are one use, and it makes sense. I mean, it's the funny thing. It links to that cipher system idea, which came from
yeah,
Numenera, where you have all these gadgets which are one off. But that never really made sense in Numenera. These were like old
yeah,
gadgets they work once and they break. In the cipher system, they had to shoehorn it into every different genre. It
yeah.
didn't make any sense.
It doesn't make
Actually,
sense to me.
here it does make sense. It's an experimental thing Q Branch have given
Yeah,
you, and it's going to work once. It works
yeah.
once, and then it doesn't work.
Which movie did there was one of the Roger Moore movies where he had a jetpack. You know,
No, I
there's a
don't
big
know.
difference between
Sean Connery
Bond
had a
having
jetpack.
it might have been no crap. Now I'm gonna have
Well,
to
you said
edit.
last week that Roger Moore had was it a dart thing from something that he used more than once? But generally, the
That
whole
was in
point of a
Moonraker,
gadget,
the little dart thing on his
yeah,
wrist because he
generally
shot
the
the
gadgets get
yeah,
used once.
yeah, usually they get used once.
And so the idea of spending a fortune point to have a gadget which the GM didn't say you've got to get you out of a situation works perfectly. You make it on the fly. And if the GM knows you need it in advance, then you've been given it. It's just
Right.
gear, just
And
equipment.
I guess you wouldn't have to spend points to activate
No,
that which you've been given, but recognize that upon activation, it's it's good for that scene and that's the end of it. Now,
yeah,
like you were talking about Moonraker, the little wrist dart shooter thing, he used it twice. He used it, yeah, anyway. If you wanted to as a player reactivate an asset that you'd already used, then you would spend the fortune as if
yeah,
you were retconning and saying, well, I actually have the digital lock picker in my phone.
yeah. And
Okay.
I think this is actually quite a nice different, because other games have like Leverage did it. Blades in the Dark has rules for sort of flashbacks and planning that where you've
Yeah.
already done the planning and this is just a way of putting that into James Bond using rules that are essentially already present in 2D20.
Yeah.
A combination of using traits and using fortune. This is a different use for fortune, but it's still just another kind of idea to give an idea of, Bond doesn't plan, but he's usually very resourceful and usually has a bunch of stuff.
Well, I think the assumption is that like he's so good and he's
Yeah.
so experienced that in the back of his mind he's always got contingencies ready to go. That makes sense. Do you think when you say fortune, do you mean it would be fortune, but perhaps there would be an economy where instead of, in all the 2D20 games now, you spend one fortune at a time. There are no two fortune expenses that I remember at least, but there are higher price momentum spends. Would you call fortune fortune and keep that doing the things that fortune does? And then would you create a separate economy that would activate these things?
No, I think then it's
Or
complicated. You've got multiple things. I think I'd still use fortune, and one of the fortune spends is to activate an
okay,
asset. But then I think I would give the player, particularly because there's only one player.
you gotta
So
give
I
them
think
more.
I would give the player more fortune at the start of the session, or have you get more fortune every act or something. So maybe start with 3 or 4 fortune, not 2, but then maybe at the start of the second act of think of it like a film, you'd get 2 more fortune, and at the start of the third, the final act, you'd get 2 more fortune. So or you'd have more ways of every time Bond does something very Bond-esque, you throw the player another because
Yeah,
the rules do have
I
things
like
for
that.
when you do something like determination has rules for when you play to your blah blah blah, you get determination.
Yeah.
Well, you could just go when you do something very Bond-esque or describe something in a very Bond-esque way, you get a fortune point back. So yeah,
There could
you can
also
easily
be
put in a way of doing it.
you could also establish, and this would definitely be meta-ish, but you as GM could establish like on a scene by scene basis, there are certain goals or a certain amount of like accomplishment, and I'm working this out loud that Bond would have to accomplish during the scene. And think about this: there are times when you buy an extra D20 or two with momentum, and then because you do that and you roll, you actually get back more you get back more momentum than you spent. And so maybe as the session or the story goes on, as it proceeds, as Bond becomes more successful and accomplishes more things, he gets he replenishes and maybe even grows his amount of fortune
Hmm.
in anticipation of the giant assault on the hidden volcano base.
Yeah. I
Or
mean,
he's going
like
to
it could,
spend a lot of it.
yeah, because it could be things like if you save a particular NPC instead of letting them die, then you get a fortune point because that's a bit more heroic. And when you know, kill a bad guy, but you kill him in a more complicated and then way, and then make a
Rube
pun
Goldberg
about it,
killings.
you get fortune. Well, because Bond can just shoot people.
No.
But shooting people is dull compared to pushing them into vats of things and out of windows and getting them to hang themselves. And that's more interesting.
Yeah,
Just
or
shooting people is boring.
yeah, sticking it like electrical cables in Jaws's mouth, or yeah, having what's his name, Goldfinger, gets sucked out of an airplane window. Um, yeah, yeah, and Goldfinger being sucked out of an airplane window would not have been as amusing if Goldfinger had been thin.
No.
I think that was part of it. Uh, yeah, but I could see an economy that on a meta level, on a game, not a story level, that the player would want to accomplish not specific things, but make clear progress on a scene by scene basis to gather more of these fortune points in anticipation of being able to call in the ninjas, get the extra gadgets, stop the rocket launch, like all those gonzo things that Bond is able to do virtually all at once, make everything come together in the last scene. You want to have the points there to be able to do that. So I think that could work.
Or maybe you've run out of fortune at the end of the film and it all goes horribly wrong. Spoilers.
And Bond dies. No,
That never happened.
no, that never happens. No, actually, you know what has happened? Worse has happened. Bond has become brooding, and Bond has become like hand wringing and navel gazing. So, but we won't go there. Um, okay, okay, I like all of that. I think all that makes sense. Oh my golly, what was the other thing?
So the other big thing we had was an idea of trackers.
Well, and trackers and the idea of a plot, the villain's plan as almost like a character.
Yeah. So we had this idea of like you would have the plan would, so it wouldn't just be it wouldn't just be a tracker. There would be a bar, well, two. I think because I'm thinking of computer game terms
Yeah,
now, which is stupid because you wouldn't show it on the screen. But you'd have like a plan tracker and a Bond tracker, and the plan has its tracker, and then it has a bunch of descriptions that certain so at the end of a scene, depending on what happens, the villain's plan will increase.
yeah,
And then at different points, it might have different traits that are existing. So maybe the henchman only pops up when you reach a certain rating, or you can only activate certain, at certain ratings because it's getting so close to failing. Q branch steps in and gives you help. So
yeah,
there could be a whole, I think on paper terms, you'd have a page, you have a tracker, and you'd written all this stuff underneath it that at certain levels, different things would happen, and this is how it will go up. And I think one of the things I said is I don't like the idea of it going up and coming down again. It wants to always be going towards the end.
yeah.
But at the same time, Bond is filling up like his Bond tracker or his, because say solving the plot is too long. So it's just his Bond tracker. But as Bond does stuff, so as he kills bad guys, as he finds the next clue, as he kills the next henchman, he fills up his thing. And the idea, like before the end of the session, if Bond, because it's very meta this. So if Bond fills his tracker before the plan fills up, or even actually, because we said if the plan fills up, the missiles are launched.
Yeah.
But then Bond fills his. So yes, the missiles are launched, but he then disarms them in space.
Or
so,
it just ups the tension. The other thing that I think is this would come into play in a positive way in a couple of ways is that if this would give the GM a really concrete way to remind him or herself to apply pressure to Bond.
Yeah.
As the villain's plan, like a character, makes progress toward its own goals, its completion, its fruition. This then reminds the GM, like, oh, now this other thing is happening, or this is happening, and it forces, because over-analysis leads to paralysis, and players love to plan and think through things and stuff like that, but there's a point at which they dither. And so this gives the GM something concrete. You're looking at it, you're like, oh, the missile's launched. Now what are you going to do? Okay. I like also the the value of the a planner of some sort like that that has tracks, and maybe you're even rolling. Maybe you're treating it like the plan is acting like a character. You personify it through mechanics. That would really help you as GM as story planner to really work out like how does this whole thing how does it work out? Like, what does it look like? What is the villain's plan? That doesn't mean that it becomes a railroad, but what it means is that you develop your side of it, so the villain and his or her plan come alive more than just like the goblins sitting in the dungeon room waiting to be slaughtered. Like, the plan is evolving, and it's so if Bond sits, the plan keeps going.
Yeah, I think that would be the idea, that you'd have this, you have a tracker that you've drawn out and you're checking off boxes, but there's multiple different ways that it can go up, and there's multiple different ways Bond can improve his. So Bond goes to one location and he meets a henchman there who he kills, and Bond's thing goes up, and the plan tracker doesn't go up, and then he also finds a clue, so again his goes up, and then he stops a shipment, but because he didn't go to another place, or maybe he missed another clue, there's another reason it goes up. So it means it's not linear. You can have lots of different scenes, but depending on different things going, these things are happening all the time. And you probably wouldn't show the player. You just drop things. He meets someone, the person says, "Oh, our plan's close to launching," and when you get to the big bad guy and he does his big monologue, then again the Bond villain tells Bond that you can't stop me, and literally any minute now the thing's going to go off, and you haven't got a hope. And then of course sticks him in a chair and walks away because
that's what he does. I think it would actually be neat, like I think if we're able to make this work, like the GM and the player who are going to play one-on-one like that are going to be, these aren't going to be your typical players, because they recognize like I have to bear a much bigger burden of making things happen. And I think that two of them together, like just two people, would make for the potential for a lot of rich storytelling is there. I actually think it'd be really neat at the end, like after it's over, after the missiles have launched and Bond has figured out a way to disarm them in space and do whatever. It'd be cool to be able to sit down with your player or with your GM and look over the plot as character sheet and go, oh, that's what was going on. And just talk through like the other side of the story, like a director's chair sort of approach. I think the kind of people who would dig this sort of game might be interested in that. That would add value.
I'm genuinely surprised you didn't just think the same thing I just thought as to where that was heading.
Where's that headed?
Well, you need a situation where there's only two people who both know the rules familiarly. And there's only two at a time. There's this.
That's it. Is this?
So we could literally could do a bunch of sessions where, like, at some point, like once we've actually hashed out the system,
a great idea.
Well, it would give us a bunch of it. It'd be a complete departure from what we normally do. But at some point, when we've hashed out the rules a little bit, there's nothing stopping both of us going away and coming up with our version of Bond and our version of a plot, and then taking a few. I mean, you actually wouldn't need many episodes because it's only 1-to-1. I bet in 2 episodes you could run an adventure, and then we could record it. So we could do one with you being the GM and me being Bond, and vice versa. Except you'd have to be an American Bond, so can't have that.
You know what I'll do? I'll just adopt a bad British accent.
Well, ideally not your bad Cockney accent, because we don't want the street urchin Bond. Right, governor.
No, Roy, where Right is pronounced Royt. Roy. It's what? What the hell is he saying? You don't sound like that. Don't worry.
But yeah, that would be a bunch of episodes we could do.
Okay.
Yeah, some point we'll have to nail out the system. Like I said, that's not going to be happening anytime soon. I don't want to work on Star Wars. But...
Well, what if? Okay, what the one thing that we haven't talked about, and this goes back to this actually is important for the character sheet, and also the plot as character sheet. What kind of stress do we have? Because the Bond taking wounds, Bond getting killed, like. I suppose you could do that, but that's not.
I think you stick to just the stand, like what Dishonored has. It has a very, very long stress track.
Okay.
It's like I think there's about but you just have stress, and I wouldn't worry about like wounds, or if you have wounds, they would be just like traits or truths.
Yeah. You could
So
potentially lose, you could lose one of those assets.
yeah, I think that's, I mean, if you look at, with the one exception, you know, Bond very rarely gets even injured.
No.
And realistically does, you know, I guess the most obvious thing is if Bond gets, if he gets stressed out in one scene, he is knocked out. At that point, the villain catches him.
Yeah.
Now, we know what's going to happen when the villain catches him. They are going to put him in a torture device he can escape, or in a prison cell that he can escape, or someone's going to let him out. So
Yeah.
actually, Bond being stressed out, I think that you would have it on your plan, your Bond villain plan sheet. You would have, right, if Bond is stressed out, then I gain, you know, 3 ticks on my tick chart.
Yes.
That's what would happen. So, you know, it's never going to be, it, you know, if Bond gets to bottom, he is either, he is knocked out, or he is momentarily injured, or if he's in a vehicle, his vehicle is destroyed, or so on. So I don't, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. I think it's easy to think on the pulp side of, right, let's make the assumption of every Bond film, bar one, spoilers, the Bond can't die.
Yeah.
Which
Here's
is
something else too. Okay, Bond can't die, but instead of wounds, they become, it manifests as some form of setback.
Yeah.
Like a setback to Bond's plan, or it could be like Bond's efforts, or it could be used as a way to add, I mean, I'm saying this figuratively, not literally, because I'm envisioning this plan as character differently than this, but it would essentially provide work to that extended task track. So yeah, and then you work it out in the story as makes sense. Like, does Bond get knocked out? Like, is he knocked out with a sap in an alley and he's left there? And then like the villain is able to get things like kidnap the girl while he's unconscious.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing. But Bond might not be able to die, but Felix Leiter can die,
sure.
and M can die, and the girl of that part of the film,
she gets spray painted gold
die.
and died, or gets killed by
and, you know,
crabs or something
his
like
sidekick, which is, he was a really cool sidekick character, he can die.
Yep.
And the person who's in charge of MI5 for that branch, they, you know, so there's, yeah, Bond isn't going to die, but everybody else is fair game.
But those are the assets. Those are the assets that the player would use fortune to activate. And so you deny one of those. You blow up the Bond suffers a setback, and his rocket ship Lotus gets blown up.
Well, I mean, that happens in it's one of the Roger Moore. So I think it's the one after The Spy Who Loved Me. He comes out of the, I can't remember which one it is, but it's it's not View to a Kill. It's the one set in Greece. He runs out with this girl to get to his Bond car, his Lotus, and it blows up.
Yeah.
And then he has to nick a 2CV and escape down a mountain in a terrible
yellow
Citroen.
Think that, like, so you as GM initially, like during the mission briefing or whatever, you know, you provide the equipment you want Bond to have based on the kinds of story things that you envision. Okay, great. Well, that doesn't mean that Bond has to have those things. No. Bond suffers a setback because of, you know, stress taken, and what do? You deny the asset. You take the asset away from them. They now cannot spend to activate the thing. And they've got to figure the player's got to figure out some way to move forward. I mean, that's one of the great things about these meta currency economies is that, you know, if you're a crappy GM, you're going to be adversarial, or potentially adversarial with your players anyway. If you're a good GM, you're not going to be an adversarial GM. But one of the things that I love about the meta currencies is they make me think, because I'm sitting there with these tokens in front of me, and it just reminds me to think on the fly, to keep adjusting and tweaking the story to make it interesting. And yeah, you could decide that, you know, the jetpack is there, but then if you decide that the jetpack's more interesting to blow up or have malfunction and have like Bond go, like, you know, fly over and land somewhere else. So that's interesting. Instead of Bond taking like damage, you know, maybe he gets tired out or something like that. But
I think it's the most likely, you know, it's the accumulation of all of the things that's happening. It's the mental fatigue and the physical exhaustion of doing all the Bond stuff. And maybe he took a glancing hit or got shot, but he's got a bulletproof vest, more likely not. But, and you know, so on. I mean, that'd be like John Wick, who just like, I mean, the most recent John Wick was just insane because he gets shot so many times, but you know, his suit's bulletproof, so he's fine. But it's not
Okay.
just that. He gets hit by like about 5 cars and falls off like 3 buildings in the space of sort of the last hour of the film. You're just like, how is he still
Yeah.
walking? This is insane.
Yeah.
It's like, but anyway, it's funny.
I think that you solved the problem. Long stress track, and instead of wounds, if we want to keep with 5, we want to keep with something like that. Well, when those, or there be some kind of like threshold that then it affects either Bond's assets, or it affects the villain's, the progress of the villain plan.
Yeah, I
Because
think
Bond
because
doesn't die.
if he takes a nice big hit, I think the most obvious one is to, like the idea of if you take 5, you would have taken a wound. I think then, going for the assets or a passerby, or not passerby, an NPC, is probably the way to go with that. So yeah.
And when it comes to dealing with henchmen and crowd mobs and squads and stuff like that, I like how Dune deals with it. No challenge dice. When you're successful against one of these minor, you defeat them. And if you're against multiple simultaneously, you just spend one additional momentum. It's like obtain information. You just drop one additional momentum and you defeat these other cronies and flunkies. I think that's an easy way to go with. And we don't, like I said, we don't need challenge dice.
No, I don't. There's no need for challenge dice in this. We're not talking about different. Why does Bond use a different weapon? Because he happens to have one, and if he's using like a big rocket launcher, he's destroying a plane or a tank with it. So it's it's irrelevant.
Okay, so what now you and I need to do is, on a shared document, work on this. We need to work on this because I think you're absolutely right. I think it'd be really cool for you and I to work this thing out and then play it. I think too, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's like the over and analyzing things, overthink. If it's worth thinking about, it's worth overthinking about. That's my mantra. I think you could play now. It would have a different vibe, but you could play a lot of other properties using, like Conan. I mean, really, in the movies, or hell, in the books, it's not an ensemble cast. The Conan role-playing game, I think, is interesting because it's really a gritty sword and sandal, sword and sorcery RPG set in Conan's world. But Conan is not that. Conan's stories. It's
always Conan by himself.
Yeah. Knight Rider. How's that? You want to play Knight Rider? You could do that. You want to play Magnum PI? You could do that. Because really, unfortunately, TC was super cool and Rick was cool at the King Kamehameha Club, but really they were sidekicks, full on sidekicks.
It's funny we don't get programs like that anymore, do we? Because now it has to be an ensemble cast with a a bunch of people and ticking a lot of boxes. But yeah, back in the day when it was just Michael Knight.
What other properties or what other either movies?
The John Wick that I mentioned earlier actually falls into, again, he's a ridiculously capable person that just murderizes everyone.
Yeah.
But really all you have is combat in those films. But Jason Bourne, similarly, again, is another single spy doing single spy stuff. Actually, if you were going to throw in sort of more interesting talents or different traits, this will work. A lot of superheroes are singular.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of them. So, the thing has become, let's have multiple superheroes at a time because we can throw more people on screen. But for a long time, yes, Batman and Superman are part of the Justice League, but they still have individual stories. I mean, that's why we don't get to see Robin on screen, because he's inherently a daft character. So we just have lots of Batman films, and it's always just Batman by himself. And again, he has actually loads of assets. So Batman actually works really well with this, because arguably Batman is just like the American Bond with lots more money, and he's private. In fact, he's the American Bond because he's not government run. He's a private individual.
That's a good point.
Capitalist.
Huh.
Well, that's what Batman is, isn't he? He instead of being about duty, he's about revenge. But he does the same thing. He solves bad guy plots. With gadgets
that no one else can.
James, and he never has the same woman from one thing to the next.
This is true.
And his parents are dead. I mean, he is just James Bond. The funny thing is that he's still played by British actors.
Yeah.
Just can't let you Americans play anyone apparently anymore.
No. Interesting. Okay. All right. So then we have to commit to work on this. And I know you and I both in the next month, like June into July, there isn't going to be time for a lot of effort, but we'll create a shared document. We'll start kicking around ideas. We'll rough up the character using approaches, and then this plot as character sheet, which could mirror the player character sheet. I think that would make sense. And then we will work to put it together and then demo it with each other. I think that'd be terrific. I love it.
There we go. Done the character sheet.
Stop it. It's not. He just put a picture of the freaking Dishonored character sheet there, which is not going to work.
I just need a pen now so I can scribble out the thing that says void points, because with the exception of that, it's basically spot on.
Yeah. All right. So we don't got it, but we got enough right now that we can work on it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.